In a previous video, I've talked about how energy is captured for living organisms through the process of photosynthesis. Today, I want to go on to talk about how that energy then is released inside cells in order to be used through the process of cellular respiration. So just to review the important facts about energy, all organisms need energy. This is an essential component of life. And energy makes the matter that makes us up, makes matter move both inside and outside of cells. Living organisms are able to extract energy that has been stored in chemical bonds in the food that those organisms eat. Ultimately, of course, it's the sun that provides the energy for life, and through the process of photosynthesis by plants and algae and certain bacteria, this light energy is converted to chemical energy, and it is stored then in the chemical bonds that make up the molecule of glucose, a simple sugar or a carbohydrate. And then organisms have to break those bonds in order to release the energy, because while it's still in the bond, it's not accessible. But as the bond is broken, that energy is released and it can be captured and used by the organisms. So the way this happens is through a set of chemical reactions known as cellular respiration. The word cellular in front of the word respiration just distinguishes it from the breathing that we do, that we often do call respiration. So we're talking about what is happening inside cells. Now, all types of organisms, autotrophs, which can provide their own food through photosynthesis, autotrophs and heterotrophs, though, both need to do respiration. They need to do cellular respiration. So just because something that is photosynthetic can make its own food, it doesn't mean it could get that energy from that food unless it is doing respiration. The energy, though, in that glucose molecule is too much for the cell to handle all at once. It's like a tremendous explosion. As I've said in class, it's like if your gas tank would explode in your car all at once, you'd have a fireball. You would not have a car that you could drive down the road. And so in a car, the explosion is carefully controlled inside your engine with just a little bit of fuel put in at a time and allowing a small explosion to happen inside the engine block. And a similar thing is happening inside cells because cellular respiration releases energy in carefully controlled small amounts that can be then collected by a molecule known as ATP. And those little bits of energy, as the glucose molecule is slowly being broken down, those little pieces that are then put into ATP, the ATP molecules can transport that energy around the cells. And ATP is being used all over the place in any living organism all the time. So cellular respiration, like a lot of these other metabolic processes, is really a series of chemical reactions, because in order to break bonds, you have to have a chemical reaction going on. These chemical reactions for cellular respiration most often occur in mitochondria, at least in eukaryotic cells that have those organelles. It is a very complicated process with many steps, but we want to just focus on the basic reaction. And the basic reaction says we start with 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 molecules of oxygen gas, and through cellular respiration we produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and then some energy, which comes out both as heat and being put into these molecules of ATP. So we have an illustration here showing how the glucose and oxygen go into the cell, because of course the glucose will come from the food that the organism is eating and the oxygen will be coming from the atmosphere. And in the mitochondria we have cellular respiration giving us carbon dioxide and water as a waste product, and ATP is a very useful product, the whole reason why we do cellular respiration in organisms to begin with. So just to go over again, the inputs or the reactants of respiration are glucose and oxygen gas, and these are changed into the outputs or the products of carbon dioxide gas, water, and then the energy, which is transferred from being stored in glucose to being at least temporarily stored in ATP. These inputs and outputs look very familiar. We've seen them before in photosynthesis, and photosynthesis and respiration really are complementary reactions. The reactants for one reaction end up being the products of the other. So photosynthesis produces substances that are used in order to do cellular respiration, and cellular respiration produces substances that are used in photosynthesis. Now let's take a closer look at ATP. Remember, ATP is the molecule that carries these small amounts of energy around the cell after that energy has been extracted from glucose by cellular respiration. ATP itself is a nucleotide. Nucleotides are the building blocks of nucleic acids, if you remember from our previous study of biological molecules. And generally, we think of nucleotides as being put together to make DNA or RNA. But we also have a lot of ATP, individual nucleotides, not connected one to another to make something larger. And the nucleotide of ATP actually has 3 phosphate groups. In DNA and RNA, those nucleotides only have 1 phosphate group. So between the second and third phosphate groups, there is the bond that holds it together is a high energy bond. And so that bond can hold a lot of energy when it is made, and it releases a lot of energy when it is broken. Releasing that energy by taking off the bond, as we see over here in the left-hand illustration. So the bond has been broken to release the energy, and so the molecule that's left is known as ADP, and it's kind of like a partially charged rechargeable battery. So it's given up some of its energy, but we can recharge it. We can put energy into it and reattach that third phosphate group to create ATP. So the T and the D stand for tri and di. So ATP is adenosine triphosphates because it has 3 phosphate, and ADP is adenosine diphosphate because it only has 2. But all you have to do is hook that 1 phosphate group back on by adding some energy, and you've created ATP. And ATP goes back and forth between the ADP version and the ATP version over and over again over the course of a day. It can be reused and recharged as long as that molecule hangs together and doesn't break apart in another area of it. It can be reused over and over again. Now, cellular respiration, we talked about how glucose and oxygen go into it, but oxygen is optional because respiration happens with and without oxygen. When it is happening with oxygen, it is known as aerobic respiration. So we have aerobic cellular respiration when oxygen is involved, when oxygen and glucose are the reactants. But if oxygen is not present and just glucose goes into the reaction, we have anaerobic cellular respiration because anaerobic means without oxygen. Aerobic respiration does produce more ATP, somewhere between 30 and 36 molecules for every 1 molecule of glucose, because it really breaks the glucose down completely. It takes it all the way to carbon dioxide and water. There's nothing connected the way it used to be when aerobic cellular respiration is done with that molecule of glucose. But because it's breaking that glucose molecule down all the way, it takes longer. And so it's not really a good source of super quick energy. Aerobic respiration happens in 2 places in the cell. It starts in the cytoplasm and then moves into the mitochondria if oxygen is available. So here's our mitochondria over here with its zigzaggy membrane on the inside. It is a double membrane organelle like the chloroplast. And it's just, this particular illustration is showing you some of the steps. So we've got multiple steps involved in cellular respiration, which we'll learn a little bit more about in another video. But anaerobic respiration produces much less ATP. It only produces 2 molecules as compared to 30 to 36 molecules because it does not break the glucose down completely. But because it's not breaking the glucose molecule all apart, it happens much more quickly. So it becomes a more useful process when quick energy, really quick energy, is needed. Anaerobic respiration doesn't use mitochondria because it doesn't use oxygen. It happens in the cytoplasm, and it can go in 2 different directions. It can produce alcohol as an end product, so the glucose essentially is broken in half, or it can produce lactic acid, which again is 1 glucose molecule being broken in half. This illustration on the left is an example of what's happening with the lactic acid. So you see we're producing lactic acid here. We kind of read it from the center to the side. We start off with glucose that is broken down in a process known as glycolysis. That's what this arrow says, which just means splitting the glucose. And then the process produces lactic acid and gives you 2 ATP. And you can see we've got those NAD, in this case NADH, no P, just NADH, but these are still electron carrier molecules like we saw with photosynthesis. So some of the food that we eat gets its characteristic kind of tart flavor from lactic acid anaerobic respiration happening by organisms inside that food. Yogurt, for example, is made by bacteria, and those bacteria work on the milk sugar. They use that as their food source and produce lactic acid, which makes yogurt tangy. Sauerkraut, you have a similar thing going on, breaking down the cabbage to form that kind of characteristic tangy flavor of sauerkraut. And your own muscles, if you have worked your muscles hard and you've experienced that burn, well, that is due to a buildup of lactic acid in your muscle cells. So when you are calling upon those muscle cells to contract and to work hard and vigorous exercise, there is not enough time to make ATP to make that contraction happen only with aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration has to happen to power your muscle cells, but that lactic acid buildup can eventually become quite painful. The example on the right, again, we start with glucose that undergoes glycolysis. So the glucose is broken in half, and again, without oxygen, we are producing an alcohol known as ethanol, and it also does produce carbon dioxide. So you may be aware that beer and wine and champagne is well known for having tiny bubbles, and that's because that particular alcoholic beverage, that alcohol is being made by organisms that do anaerobic respiration, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct, and that makes the bubbles. Yeast breads also, they rise because the yeast inside the bread is breaking down and making carbon dioxide. There is alcohol present in yeast bread, but it will evaporate when you bake your bread, so you don't really realize that you're having a product that did have some alcohol being produced along with the carbon dioxide. So just as kind of an end point, how much ATP are we using ourselves? With a little bit of research, I found that it's estimated that an adult human uses between 100 to 150 moles of ATP a day. And moles is a way that we measure large amounts of very small molecules when we're talking about atoms and molecules. A mole is, the amount a mole is the number 6 with 23 zeros after it. So it is a really big number. So if we break that down by 30 trillion cells in the average adult human body and by 1,440 minutes in every day, we estimate that about 1 billion molecules of ATP are being used by cells in your body every minute. There are a lot of molecules in your body, and there's a lot of ATP there. And each molecule of ATP, because it can be recycled between the ATP and the ADP form, it's recycled about 1,000 to 1,500 times a day, according to the sources I found. Or we could say you recycle your body weight in ATP molecules daily. So however much you weigh, well, that's how many molecules of ATP that you have recycled. So cellular respiration, in order to provide all of those ATPs for all of those energy-needing processes that keep us alive, that can never stop. Without cellular respiration, life cannot go on. So this provides my introduction to this very important process that all living things do. As we do some of the other activities in class, your understanding will be expanded and we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty details. But remember, all organisms, autotrophs and heterotrophs, do cellular respiration in order to release the energy that is in the food molecule so that they can power all the activities that have to happen for life.